1978 was a bad year for crime and violence. In Italy, Red Brigade leaders went on trial, but their followers kidnapped and murdered ex-Premier Aldo Moro. In Guyana, an extraordinary mass suicide took place, as the Reverend Jim Jones persuaded 913 of his followers to drink poison. On a London street, Bulgarian defector Georgi Markov was killed with a poison umbrella. In Florida, at the beginning of the year, police arrested Theodore Bundy, who turned out to have killed at least 23 girls. And in Chicago, Illinois, in December, there was a lot of activity in and around number 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in one of its suburbs, Northwood Park. For weeks now, neighbors had been aware that police cars had been staking it out, and they could not guess why. Then a shockwave ran through the neighborhood as these bodies were carried out. The rumors flew. They were boys who had been murdered. There had been homosexual orgies. There were dozens of bodies under the house and in the garden, some of them there for 6 years. Incredibly, the rumors were all true. The man who lived alone in the house was called John Wayne Gacy. He was a roly-poly building contractor, known as a worker for charity, an ex-member of the Junior Chamber of Commerce, a pillar of the local Democratic Party, who sometimes dressed up as a clown to entertain the kids in the hospital. He was no trouble to anyone, as the police soon discovered when they talked to his neighbors, such as Edward Grexer.
Never a sound, not a sound, never. Not even, like they've asked about screaming or anything, never a sound out of that house. It's always been a quiet house.
Never any noise or anything?
No, other than maybe doing some construction work at night, outside, a little loudness that way, sawing and things like that, but I attribute that to his work.
As his house and garden were slowly pulled apart in the search for more bodies, so his reputation disintegrated too. People who had been pleased to accept his donations and assistance now regretted the day they had their photograph taken shaking his hand. People like the mayor of Chicago, Michael Bilendik. But the mother of one of the victims remembered their high opinion of John Gacy.
He was a very nice man to work for, and he liked the kids, and my son told me he was a politician, and he says, boy, if you stick with that guy, you could go far. He's got a lot of connections. See, and this is what the boys liked about him.
For charity, he had transformed himself into Pogo the Clown, and he had organized 3 events for President Jimmy Carter's re-election fund, where this embarrassing photo of him with the First Lady, Rosalind Carter, was taken. And still the bodies emerged from the Pandora's box of evil. The search, briefly suspended for the 2 days of Christmas, had found 18 dead youths by the 27th of December. John Gacy's world started to fall apart at 11:30 p.m. on the 11th of December, when Elizabeth Peast went to the Des Plaines police station. She asked them to check on her 15-year-old son, Robert, who had been missing since 9 o'clock. He had been in a local pharmacy when Gacy approached him and talked about needing boys to work for him. Robert told his mother he was going to see a man about a job. When she telephoned the pharmacy, they mentioned John Gacy. Contacted on the phone by the police, Gacy said, "I know the kid is missing, but that's not important to me." He was asked to go to the police station and finally arrived in the middle of the night, with mud on him. When they searched Gacy's home, the police didn't find Robert Peast, but they did find a vital clue, a receipt for films from the pharmacy. It had been in the boy's pocket. The police staked out his home and followed him in his car. After a week of this pressure, Gacy boldly invited two of the officers in to have breakfast with him. The policeman noticed a nasty smell. Gacy's explanation was that he had unplugged his sump pump. Dissatisfied with his explanation, the police returned with a search warrant and opened the trapdoor into the crawl space beneath the house. Water had softened the dirt and disturbed what was buried there. To their horror, they found 3 bodies and parts of others. Arrested and charged with murder, Gacy finally admitted to more than 30 victims. Mostly youths in their teens, one of them was as young as 9 years old, and others were mature men. He confessed to luring them to his house, usually with promises of jobs, although some were male prostitutes he picked up in Chicago's homosexual areas. Day after day, the headlines reported new and horrifying totals. Soon, Gacy was describing what he had done to his victims. Once he got them back home, he would ply them with liquor and offer to show them conjuring tricks. These would involve handcuffs, which he would refuse to take off, and then ropes he put round their necks. At this point, he would start enjoying himself sexually and finally throttle them, some with a rosary, others with a tourniquet he had made out of a board and ropes. Then he would bury them in the crawl space, and when that got full up, in the garden. The last 5 bodies of the 33 Gacy is known to have killed, he simply shoved into his car and threw off a bridge into the Des Plaines River. Robert Peast was one of them, which was why Gacy had been so late in reporting to the police station and why his clothes were so muddy. The bodies were all dredged from the riverbed. Suddenly anxious to be as helpful as he could, John Gacy drew a map of the crawl space, showing where the bodies were buried, and he agreed to go back to the house to point out to the digging team where to work. Named after John Wayne, the film star, John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago in 1942. As a child, he was frequently beaten by his alcoholic father and abused by at least one of the family friends. He became a shoe salesman and married a colleague whose father set him up as manager of a Kentucky Fried Chicken chain in Waterloo, Iowa. Now he had a source of young men coming to work for him, and he lured several of them into a back room where he would handcuff them and demand sex before he would let them go. One of them escaped and went to the police. The apparently successful and popular young businessman was arrested. On the 28th of December, 1968, 10 years to the day before Bob Peast's body was dragged from the Des Plaines River, the 26-year-old Gacy drew a 10-year jail sentence from Judge Peter Van Meter. But he had no previous convictions and was a model prisoner, so he served only 18 months. His wife filed for divorce, and as soon as he was out of jail, he moved to Chicago and started a construction business. He was arrested again for picking up a teenage boy for sex, but was released when the boy wouldn't appear in court. Little of this leaked out, and his career again seemed to be prospering. In Chicago, he met up with an old flame, Carol Hoff. On the 1st of June, 1972, Gacy married again, and she moved into his house. Friends who attended the reception recalled that there was an odd smell. Gacy explained that water kept leaking into the crawl space. His marriage didn't go well, and he began to beat up his wife. Then he started to cruise Chicago's gay areas more openly, and was more interested in attractive boys like John Butkovich, who worked for him. Gacy and John had a row, and the youth vanished. More boys, like Sam Stapleton, aged 14, disappeared. Boys like Rick Johnston, aged 15, whose mother had dropped him off at a pop concert. And another employee, Greg Grodzik. His parents employed a private eye, who couldn't find any trace of him. Greg's friend John Schick went missing too. His ring was found at the house. Gacy's violence became too much for his wife Carol, and she left. Then neighbors began to notice strange goings-on, but naturally did not believe that they were in any way sinister.
But he seemed to have a problem. Yet, and then later on the light would come on the outside. And then it'd be 2 or 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning. He'd go back out to jump in the car and off he'd go again. Those were the hours that he carried on. But I thought it was business. But it probably was some of this foul play, maybe bringing some of these young people in.
Between July and December 1977, another 8 boys were murdered, among them Matthew Ronan and Robert Gilroy, who lived just 4 blocks away, the son of a Chicago police sergeant. Robert Winch, aged 16, went off to visit a friend and was never seen again. John Gacy killed at least 33 people in 6 years, but neither the police nor the press realized that Chicago had a serial killer in its midst, let alone the worst ever. He was actually arrested on the 6th of January 1978 for sexually abusing a boy at gunpoint, but he was quickly released when he claimed that the youth was a willing participant. Once the dreadful truth was known, the police tried to explain how he had got away for so long.
When we in the Chicago Police Department first became aware of this gentleman 2 years ago, we put him under surveillance for over 30-some days, and we could never have, we never established probable cause that he was committing an offense.
Even more extraordinary was what happened after he made a pickup near this expressway. Jeff Rignall, the only survivor of Gacy's attacks, later spoke out.
What were the circumstances? I mean, how did you make his acquaintance?
I walked out of our apartment building, and which has a circular drive, and he headed me off at the sidewalk and commented on my suntan, of which I had just come back from Florida, and offered me to smoke a joint, and because it was cold, and I said sure, and I hopped in the car.
Gacy chloroformed him, and he found himself naked and locked in a kind of pillory where he was alternately raped and chloroformed for a night. He begged to be released, promising to say nothing. Rignall woke up here, with his clothes and money intact, but bleeding and damaged. When he came out of hospital, the police told him there was no hope of locating his attacker, so he decided to search for himself. He waited at the expressway exit till he spotted Gacy's car, a distinctive black Oldsmobile. He took the number and went back to the police, who again refused to act. So he hired a lawyer and took out a civil suit. After Gacy had brazenly countersued him, Rignall settled for $3,000 towards his medical expenses.
Started to share the joint with him, and while he was doing that, Gacy took a...
Free to pursue more victims, Gacy grabbed 19-year-old Frank Landingin, who was thrown over Kankakee Bridge into the river, as were Tim O'Rourke, James Mazzara, and Robert Peast, the killing that finally caught him. When he was arrested, Gacy tried to kill himself. He had to be strapped down and continually watched, while the Chicago authorities began proceedings.
The Cook County Grand Jury this afternoon returned 7 indictments, charging John Gacy with the murders of 7 persons who have disappeared since the July of 1975. The Peast indictment charges Gacy with murder, aggravated kidnapping, deviant sexual assault, and taking indecent liberties with a child. The remaining 6 indictments charge Gacy with murder. Gacy is scheduled to be arraigned in the indictments on Wednesday before Chief Criminal Court Judge Richard Fitzgerald. Judge Fitzgerald ordered Gacy held without bond. My office is continuing to work closely with the Cook County Sheriff's Police, the County Medical Examiner, and the Illinois Department of Law Enforcement in our investigation into this case.
He's on another line, the sergeant is. Would you care to hold?
From all over the country came calls from parents of missing teenagers wondering if their sons could be among the victims. The gruesome work of attempting to put together what was left of the bodies was as slow and painstaking as an archaeological dig. Pieces of bone had to be found, tagged, assembled, and identified. The Cook County Medical Examiner, Dr. Robert Stein, was overwhelmed.
It's frightening. That's the only word I can use. Frightening.
Relatives of missing teenagers were asked to send dental records, because in many cases this would be the only way to identify the bodies. Using the skulls found under the house, forensic scientists mocked up dozens of possible projections of what the faces would have looked like. During the investigation, criminologists were struck by the similarities with a case in Texas in 1973, where Elmer Wayne Henley murdered his partner in crime, Dean Call, after an orgy of rape, sodomy, and mass murder. During his interrogation, Gacy specifically mentioned being impressed and influenced by those serial killings. The pair and an accomplice had abducted and killed at least 6 and probably as many as 27 boys in circumstances strikingly similar to the Gacy case. Speaking from the boathouse where many of the bodies were found, the Texan investigators said they were shocked by the news from Chicago.
It was almost the same thing all over again. You know, here we go again. Same type individuals, ages of the people were pretty well the same. Same type motive, the whole works.
One of them raised the unsettling possibility that Gacy had had a partner.
What he's done is so monstrous that you sort of have to have a fellow monster in it with you to share the blame. I mean, there is some comfort in another monster there.
But Gacy seemed to have acted alone. Small comfort for the parents of Robert Peast, whose persistence ended his rampage, as they attended every day of the pre-trial hearings. Judge John White barred Gacy from the hearings for his own safety and ordered more lengthy psychiatric tests. In April 1979, 8213 West Somerdale was demolished as being unsafe. Actually, it had become such a magnet for sightseers and a depressor of real estate values that the rest of the district demanded its removal, and neighbors watched in relief. It was more than a year before the case came to trial. The first task was to pick jurors who could approach the case without prejudice. At last, 16 people were chosen who were satisfactory to both prosecutors and defense, 12 to make the jury, and 4 alternates. The prosecutor's task was to prove that Gacy knew what he was doing when he lured the 33 young men into his home and was totally responsible for his actions. Gacy's lawyer, Sam Amirante, didn't deny the murders, but decided that his client should plead insanity due to multiple personalities. On the 6th of February 1980, the trial began at the Criminal Courts Building in Chicago. The lawyers made their opening statements in front of Judge Louis B. Garippo, who had been the prosecutor in the case of Richard Speck, who killed 8 student nurses in 1966. Everyone who entered the courtroom was searched for weapons. For much of the trial, Gacy listened impassively to the catalogue of evil. Defense lawyer Sam Amirante claimed that Gacy was the character in the novel Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde come to life. He told the jury, "Despite what psychiatric terms you put on it, he was so good and so bad, and the bad side of him was the personification of evil." He asked them not to decide with hate, revenge, passion, or fear, but to find Gacy not guilty by reason of insanity. The defense produced 4 psychiatrists, all of whom agreed that Gacy was one of the most complex personalities they had ever encountered, but undoubtedly psychotic and unable to differentiate good from evil. The prosecution case was that Gacy was a cold-blooded killer who was only pretending to have multiple personalities to bamboozle a jury. As Terry Sullivan, one of the prosecution attorneys, summarized, he knew what he was doing was wrong. John Gacy has accounted for more human devastation than many earthly catastrophes, but one must tremble when thinking how close he came to getting away with it. The trial took 6 weeks, but the verdict took the jury less than 2 hours. John Gacy was found guilty of more murders than anyone else in American history. Now came the arguments as to the punishment. The families of the victims had no doubt. Gregory Grodzik's mother spoke for them all.
I hope he does get the electric chair. Then it'll make everybody feel better. I'm sure it'll make the other mothers feel better, too.
Robert Peast's brother Ken agreed.
There's only one solution now.
What is that?
I want him to see him go to the chair.
The prosecutor called him the worst of all murderers, a man responsible for enough misery to last a century. The jury recommended the death sentence, responding to prosecutor Bill Kunkel's plea not to show sympathy, only justice.
What I suggested to them was that if they allowed that man, John Gacy, to walk the earth, then indeed God help us all.
The judge polled the jury to make sure they were unanimous in their recommendation of the death penalty. Then he confirmed the sentence. That afternoon, John Gacy asked the chief prosecutor to come and see him, and said that he had no animosity toward the attorneys. I think it was God's will, he told them. All the jury did was the same thing I have been trying to do myself for the last 10 years. Destroy myself.